Hi, and welcome back to the Sound of Science. Today, we're going to be talking about bacteria, which are some of the most important organisms on the planet. Life as we know it would not be possible without bacteria. So, we're going to dive into the different types of bacteria, some of the things that bacteria do for us, some of the things they do to us, and hopefully by the end, they'll make a little bit more sense to you. Bacteria exist in two domains. Now, if you are in my biology class, which is probably the only reason you're watching this video, we haven't talked about the taxonomy yet. We haven't talked about domains, but domains are basically a level of classification. There's actually three domains that exist. Eukarya is all of the eukaryotes, all the organisms that have a nucleus for that matter. Prokaryotes are the other two domains, and it's two different types of prokaryotes that are actually vastly different from one another. We're going to talk about archaea and we're going to talk about domain bacteria, but ultimately at the end, we're going to talk about bacteria in general. Let's start with the first bacteria, archaea. Archaea is that first domain that we're going to talk about. And these are ancient organisms. They're very, very similar to the other bacteria that we're going to talk about, but their cell walls are lacking this particular molecule called peptidoglycan. Their DNA is actually more similar to the DNA we find in eukaryotes than it is to other prokaryotes. They also tend to live in really extreme environments, like the Great Salt Lake. It's super salty, other things can't live there. They like to live in super hot locations. This is like the superheated vents found on the ocean floor. Or the picture that I have here is actually of a pool at Yellowstone that's so hot the water is boiling. They also sometimes live in low oxygen areas, like the digestive tracts of animals, which is why I gave you a picture of a tortoise farting. These are the bacteria that are responsible for the production of methane, and therefore these guys can cause farts. Eubacteria is the bacteria that we typically think of, or just your standard bacteria. So, eubacteria are closer to the bacteria that we normally think of. These are our standard bacteria, the same type of bacteria that usually makes us sick. Also, the bacteria that's really important recyclers in our environment. Again, they're prokaryotes. They don't have a membrane bound nucleus or other membrane bound organelles, but they can be found in places like freshwater, saltwater, and on land. And that saltwater is not too salty. These bacteria don't like those super extreme environments. They also have much different DNA, and they do have peptidoglycan in their cell walls. At this point, we're going to shift into talking about all prokaryotes, all bacteria, and just general conditions of bacteria. So, we're going to talk about the different shapes they can appear in, the way that they function, how they obtain food, how they use energy, all of those things as we go through the next several slides. To start with, let's talk about the shape of bacteria. So, bacteria basically comes in three different shapes: bacilli, which is rod shaped, cocci, which is spherical or round, and spirilla, which is spiral. And what you'll find is that the names of bacteria often give away what they look like. They tell us the shape of the bacteria. So, for instance, streptococcus, that's strep throat bacteria. Streptococcus is a round bacteria, it's spherical. I know that because it has coccus in the name. Bacteria have different ways of obtaining energy. Um, Basically, initially, you can split it into two groups: heterotrophs that take in molecules, organic molecules, in order to feed themselves, or autotrophs that create their own food. Heterotrophs, of course, are just exactly what you would think. They're going to take in things like glucose, they're going to do cellular respiration with that. Fun fact: bacteria, because they are lacking in mitochondria, actually do cellular respiration on their cell membrane. Autotrophs come in a couple of different forms. They can be photoautotrophs or chemoautotrophs. Photoautotrophs are going to do exactly what you normally think of with autotroph. They do photosynthesis. They're going to take energy from the sun, from light. They're going to use that energy to convert carbon dioxide and water into oxygen and glucose. Then they're going to use that to create ATP and feed themselves. Chemoautotrophs are chemical self-feeders. These are the guys that are able to take chemicals, and during their reactions between the different chemicals, they can actually capture that energy. When you think of chemoautotrophs, typically we're talking about organisms, bacteria that are using things like sulfur or methane, the ones that are occurring in those ocean vents where there's no sunlight to allow for photosynthesis. As far as how the energy is used, the mode of metabolism, obligate aerobes does that traditional cellular respiration. It's very effective, very efficient. You have to have a supply of oxygen in order to do cellular respiration as an aerobe. Anaerobe, which literally just means without oxygen, you have two types. You have obligate or facultative. So obligate means that it can't be in the presence of oxygen. It will die in the presence of oxygen. These particular bacteria actually do a process called fermentation. And the facultative anaerobes can either do cellular respiration or, when lacking oxygen, can actually do fermentation. The difference is fermentation is not very efficient. They're not producing much ATP with it. And so typically bacteria are going to prefer, given the option, to do aerobic cellular respiration as opposed to anaerobic cellular respiration. This slide is just a quick reminder. Photosynthesis is going to take place in the chloroplast. Respiration takes place in the mitochondria. In bacteria, of course, that's a little different. It's actually all going to be taking place pretty much in the cytoplasm and along the cell membrane. ATP is a way that we store chemical energy. We can also store energy in sugars and fats, but only because they can then be used to produce ATP. Sun is going to be the start for energy in every ecosystem, almost. Some ecosystems, of course, like those chemoautotrophs, they're that basis where the chemical reactions are the basis there. But most of the time, the sun is the basis of energy flow in ecosystems. In order to reproduce, prokaryotes are going to use a process that we call binary fission. It's a lot like cell division. It looks a little different, but it's the same basic principle. The steps are different as well. This is a type of asexual reproduction. When conditions are favorable, prokaryotes can actually reproduce about every 20 minutes. Prokaryotes also have a form of sexual reproduction that we call conjugation. They're going to create a thin tube between two bacteria, and they're going to exchange some genetic material that we refer to as plasmids. Usually it occurs as a small circle. This is how bacteria do lateral gene flow and increase their genetic diversity without mutation. Favorable conditions for most bacteria is going to be a fairly warm, moist environment with lots of food readily available, or lots of sunlight if there happens to be a photoautotroph. When conditions are not favorable, most prokaryotes, most bacteria are able to create a capsule, which is this outer coating, and it's going to help protect it from the harsh environment. In addition, the capsule is also able to prevent the bacteria from being gobbled up by some of our immune response. If you remember back from the virus video, we talked about the complement. And I specifically pointed out the macrophages, who basically Pac-Man their way through life, eating anything that they deem as an invader. So macrophages aren't able to eat bacteria that are surrounded by capsules most of the time. Remember at the beginning of this video, I told you how important bacteria are. They're some of the most important organisms on the planet. Well, this is the part where they really, really shine. Bacteria are producers. And in fact, They're responsible for about 50% of the photosynthesis that happens in the ocean. They're the basis of most food chains, to be perfectly honest. Not only are they producing the sugars that are necessary for living things, but then bacteria, some of them are decomposers. They're breaking down dead organisms. Within, truthfully, an hour, bacteria are already at work breaking down an organism that's died. And then finally, of course, bacteria are recyclers. They are able to fix nitrogen so that plants can use it, because plants can't use most nitrogen that's just free floating in the air. It has to be fixed by a bacteria. Bacteria can also be really helpful. We're actually using them in genetic engineering to create medications or products. For instance, humulin, which is a type of human insulin, is actually produced by bacteria now. We have created bacteria with human insulin genes, so they produce human insulin to make it affordable for everyone, as opposed to being something that only the very wealthy can have. In addition, bacteria are also used to break down harmful products, such as oil or the byproducts of gold mining, into harmless chemicals that can survive or that can allow organisms in the environment to survive. Um, they also are known to help us create foods such as yogurts and cheeses. And finally, they live within us and on us in a microbiome. They help keep us healthy. It actually helps prevent harmful bacteria or even harmful fungi from taking hold. There literally is just no space for them to be there. Not to mention that the microbiome living within our gut helps us digest our food. This is why, if you take something such as an antibiotic that kills bacteria, it doesn't distinguish between the good bacteria we need and the bacteria that's making you sick, which is why taking antibiotics often leaves you with an upset. So this brings us to germ theory. Germ theory is really this really complicated and kind of cool story about how humans start to realize that they're sharing the landscape with a whole bunch of microscopic organisms. So think way back to when we talked about Robert Hooke and we talked about cell theory and the very first cells that are being seen. Well, we know cells are there. We know that these microscopic organisms exist and we've seen them, but we don't really know the role that they're playing in the environment and with us until the development of germ theory. So the best doctors in the 17 and 1800s believe that we are getting sick for a couple of different reasons. It could be bad smells, which we refer to as miasmas. That's actually something that had extended far, far back, even into the Middle Ages. And the other possibility was your humors were poor. And what they meant by humors is just the movement of fluids through your body. And the worst thing that you could have is hot and cold humors mixing together. Doctors would actually hand out pamphlets to their patients with lists of foods you should not eat together at the same time, because it could potentially mess up your humors. It would react poorly and it could make you sick. The discovery of germ theory really changes how we're treating illnesses. My favorite example is Jon Snow, not Game of Thrones Jon Snow, not that guy. I mean, he's great and all, but this particular Jon Snow was an individual who was very interested in how illnesses traveled and how they could be transmitted from one person to another. So it just so happens that while Jon Snow is living in London and studying and working, there is a massive outbreak of cholera. And it seems to start in one neighborhood and then suddenly it's in several neighborhoods in London. And seemingly people that have not come in contact with each other have cholera. Now, you have to understand that cholera is a severe disease. It's a severe illness. And typically people are going to die within 24 to 48 hours of developing symptoms of cholera through massive dehydration. So, cholera is this little tiny bacteria, kind of looks like a fuzzy tic tac with a tail. Jon Snow starts drawing maps. He actually calls them ghost maps because he's looking at places where people have died of cholera or where people have just had gotten cholera. Most of them have died, some have survived. And what he discovers is that even though they're from different neighborhoods, they work in different places, they're different families, some of them have never come in contact with each other, every single individual has gotten water from one particular well. So Jon Snow convinces, in a dramatic moment, the authorities to remove the pump handle. So at the time, we don't have indoor plumbing, and sanitation in London is, to be honest, pretty bad. So Snow knows that people are getting their water from this pump. And in fact, people preferred this particular well because they said the water tasted better, which is kind of gross when you compare that with what I'm about to tell you, which is at the time, of course, without indoor plumbing, human waste is being thrown into something called a cesspool. That's where all of your waste is going. The idea is that it's going to kind of seep down into the soil and it'll be gone, right? And the problem was that the well that this particular pump was attached to had a crack in the structure, which was allowing groundwater to seep in really sort of a lateral direction rather than bringing groundwater up. And the water that was seeping in was coming from that cesspool filled with human waste. That's actually how cholera was transmitted through this outbreak. It wasn't a person to person transmission, although there were some within families. Typically, it was actually they were drinking water. When Snow looked at the water from this well, he could actually see the bacteria there. So this sets us up for what later is going to become germ theory. So this leads us to germ theory, or what we're going to refer to as Koch's postulates. Koch is a physician and researcher in Germany, and he is actually coming up with some really impressive things. He is in particular interested in finding some type of vaccine to prevent tuberculosis, which sadly he never accomplished. But he does give us germ theory, which changes medicine. So these are his postulates. These are the four things that are part of germ theory. Basically, you have to be able to find the bacteria in sick animals, not healthy, or sick organisms, but not healthy. You have to be able to find the bacteria or virus, and then grow it in culture outside of its organism that it made sick. Then you have to be able to take that grown organism, put it into a new healthy animal, and cause the illness. And then finally, when you compare that particular pathogen to the original pathogen, they should be the same. That's sort of the short version. Okay, you need to know Koch's postulates. You can put them in your own words. I just went through and explained them. You can use the same words that I did, but I just want to make sure that you understand. And believe it or not, this is the simplistic form of Koch's postulates. The actual Koch's postulates are paragraphs long each. We've talked about how bacteria can be very helpful, and now we're going to talk about how bacteria can be not so great, how it can be harmful to us. When we have bacteria that can make us sick, we refer to that as a pathogen. So bacteria can cause illnesses like Lyme's disease or tetanus, tuberculosis, bacterial meningitis, strep throat. It can also cause things like food poisoning that we get from eating spoiled food. It contains the bacteria whose job it was to break the food down, decompose it. The important thing to remember here is that there's lots of different ways that bacteria can be transmitted. A tick bite, for instance, for Lyme's disease, a break in the skin, droplets can be inhaled containing the bacteria, direct contact, all of these different ways that bacteria can be transmitted are very similar to what we saw with viruses and how viruses might be transmitted. There are some differences, but for the most part, pathogens get transmitted like pathogens, whether they're viruses or bacteria. How do we control bacteria? How do we keep it from making us sick? Well, one of the most important things we can do is physically remove the bacteria. Using good hand washing techniques isn't going to necessarily kill the bacteria all the time, but it definitely helps. And in fact, hand washing can help actually break apart the cell walls of bacteria, and the soap can actually help burst the cell membranes, and the water will wash it away. That's why it's important that you wash your hands for a minimum of about 30 seconds, 20 to 30 seconds every time with soap under running water. Disinfectants, these are chemical solutions that do kill bacteria. We use it to clean all sorts of surfaces, and that helps keep the bacteria from overrunning or growing. Food storage, making sure that you are, number one, cooking your food like you should, and making sure you're storing your food appropriately so that you don't end up with a foodborne illness. And of course, sanitation. The problem that the individuals in London ran into with cholera was that their human waste was leaking into their drinking water, and preventing that from happening was actually one of the major leap forwards in human society that helped prevent us from becoming ill. You can also use an antibiotic to treat infections once you are ill, but again, you don't want to overuse antibiotics. Overuse of antibiotics actually lends itself to creating antibiotic resistant bacteria that we don't have anything to treat, which can put us in a really serious predicament. So, making sure that you only use antibiotics when they're called for, avoiding lots of antibiotic types of products like soaps can actually help too. And don't insist on doctors giving you antibiotics for things like colds or the flu, which are caused by viruses. That is all we have time for tonight. I hope this gives you a better idea of bacteria and the role they play in our environment. And as always, thanks for watching.